Death by Gingerbread. Previously published as
The Proof is in the Pudding. Ginger Burnet Cozy Mysteries. Book 1. Clementine Moore. Prologue. To the outside observer, the scene in the living room was peaceful. A large, fawn-coloured greyhound dozed in front of the large stone fireplace, warmed by the flickering flames. To one side was the old man, resting easily in his large wingback chair, flicking through the stock market reports as he usually did at this time of night. On the opposite side of the fire, the man's beautiful wife was draped elegantly along a chaise lounge, tapping away on her sleek laptop. The observer shivered, but whether it was from the cold or longing they weren't sure. Since it was a damp, bitter night in early October, complete with a light drizzle that dampened everything, it should have been the former. But the feeling of longing was cold as an Arctic gale. There wasn't just the glass of the window separating them from the domestic scene inside. It was so much more than that. Why did the old man deserve such peace when there were so many others who were without it? Did anyone in this sleepy village really appreciate the peace they took for granted? Maybe they would when all of this was over. Chapter 1. The shriek filled every room in the small cottage. Ginger Burnet, hazel eyes wide with panic, raced down the narrow, creaking stairs. She could hear the heavy footsteps of her pursuer close behind her as she took the corner into the living room. It was barely dawn in Little Chiswick, in the county of Gloucestershire, and the house was still unlit. Every corner was darkened with shadow as Ginger dashed across the living room. Disaster struck when the woven rug laid on the smooth wooden floorboards flew out from under her feet. Ginger crashed to the ground. It was over for her. Moments after, her attacker struck with vicious precision. Letting out a yelp of pain, Ginger rolled onto her back, pushing her long brown hair out of her face. "That's my toe, you little miscreant!" Nina, the larger of the pair of British blue short-hair cats who also lived in the Georgian-era stone cottage, paused her assault on Ginger's fluffy slipper socks. Her ears flickered back and forth. "I thought we agreed that if I bought you the little dangling mouse on a string toy, you wouldn't treat my slippers as your nemesis," Ginger said, swatting lightly at Nina as the cat's wide golden eyes locked once more on the closest woolen tassel. Strolling into the living room at a far more dignified pace, the second of Ginger's cats, Miles, wandered over to investigate the chaos his sister had caused. Although one of his greenish golden eyes was milky with blindness, his other was bright with curiosity as he immediately climbed into Ginger's lap before stepping deliberately on her stomach. "Ow, that's my bladder, Your Highness." Ginger winced, shooing the cat away despite his indignant meows of protest. "Go on, the both of you. Find something else to do besides bother me. I still need to do an icing test on the cake before I leave for work. Nina, no." Slick as butter, the cat sprung out of Ginger's reach, one claw caught in the woolen weave of the knee-high grey socks. When she tugged on her prey, however, the claw slipped loose. This sudden movement was enough to convince Miles it was time to play. Ginger gasped as he used her stomach as a launch pad to attack his sister, before the two cats went skittering out of the living room. Shaking her head with a chuckle, Ginger straightened the rug, then got to her feet. Flipping on the tall lamp in the corner by her precious turntable, she trailed a finger along the collection of records filling the shelf. Pulling out an Ella Fitzgerald record, she placed it on the turntable. As the music filled the early morning in the chilly house, Ginger danced toward the kitchen, letting the energy of a new day fill her. Although she'd been up late the night before baking and had only slept in fits and starts, she was finding it easier to face each day. Of course, the events at Arlington Manor in August still haunted her dreams, but the ghosts were getting quieter. She was getting better at sleeping through the night, but after so many mornings spent watching and waiting for the sunrise to banish the memories, she found she enjoyed the fresh sense of possibility the early morning brought. So here she was at 5 a.m., dancing to Ella Fitzgerald around her kitchen, preparing to attempt an icing test for her latest cake project. Setting the kettle on to boil, she prepared her usual morning cup of peppermint tea and cafetiere of coffee. The kitchen was her favourite room in the house for obvious reasons. With its blue-grey cabinet doors and drawer fronts, floor tiles the colour of light brown sugar, and the exposed beams of the cottage giving it a homey air, Ginger spent much of her time there. When she wasn't cooking or baking for friends, family, clients who had ordered a cake, or herself, she would often sit cross-legged on one of the worn chairs reading baking articles and watching videos on her laptop at the scrubbed oak table. The table, a hefty, knife-scarred thing, had been there since before the previous owner of the cottage had moved in, back in the 60s, and Ginger loved the character it added to the room. Opening the fridge, she carefully lifted out the sweet and sticky loaf cake that had been cooling overnight. The earthy, sweet scent of stem ginger and sticky black treacle filled the kitchen. Ginger experimentally poked the rich golden brown surface, frowning at the texture. "A little dry," she murmured, setting it on the oak countertop. "Maybe the curd and buttercream will help." After pouring her tea and coffee, she set the steaming cup and cafetiere on the table and began gathering the ingredients for her buttercream icing. Soon she had a large bowl of creamy, fluffy coconut buttercream ready for spreading. However, she first halved the loaf cake and spread a generous layer of mango curd inside before layering the cake once more. "I hope Mum and Colin like the flavour," Ginger said to the house at large as she began applying the buttercream. "Getting gluten-free cake right is always a challenge." The cake was a test bake for the creation she was planning for her stepfather Colin's retirement party at the end of the month. After 27 years as a tree surgeon and manager for the woodland of a local wildlife sanctuary, he was stepping away from his job. Ginger had offered to provide the cake, and she had big plans for it. The time flew by, and before she knew it, Ginger's coffee was gone, the cake was done, and she was running late for her job at Chiswick Academy. Swearing under her breath, Ginger rushed to box up the cake, then changed out of her slipper socks and into her shoes. Wriggling into her coat and yanking on a woolen hat that mussed up her feathery bangs, she dashed out of the door with the cake box tucked under her arm. Soon, Ginger was cycling at a brisk pace along the quiet, winding country road that hid the row of 3 cottages, of which hers was the last. Farmland rolled away on both sides of the lane like textured fondant. Most of the fields contained nothing but the bristled remains of wheat and barley stalks. Crows and gulls searched for fallen grains, scattering into the air like salt and pepper as Ginger flew by on her bike. The stress of running late soon dissolved, and Ginger took a deep breath of the clean, slightly damp morning air. From somewhere there drifted the earthy, but not unpleasant scent of mulch and wet fallen leaves. By the time Ginger turned onto the long, winding gravel drive that led to the doors of Chiswick Academy, she was humming and, once again, on time. Chiswick Park was renowned as one of the best schools in the county, if not the whole of the southwest of England. It was an old institution, dating back several hundred years when it had started life as a seminary. The academy was now responsible for several hundred students from around the country and the world who lived at the school for the whole term, as well as nearly 200 more students who lived locally and only attended during the day. The myriad of affluent parents who sent their children to Chiswick Park kept the school's 7 teaching buildings and large chapel, all built of the honeyed local Cotswold limestone, in perfect condition. It also paid for the gym, swimming pool, woodworking and ceramic studios, block of stables, and personal cricket pitch. There were children everywhere as she pulled up at the front of the school, all dressed in the rick burgundy and sky blue uniform of the academy. As Ginger dismounted her bike and wheeled it into the sleek glass and metal-covered bike storage unit, complete with CCTV and multiple layers of storage, several of the faculty members heading into the building gave her a wave. One of these was Bonnie Nat, one of Ginger's longtime friends and a member of the art department at the academy. "Is that a cake box I spy in your bicycle basket?" she called, shooing several young students toward the doors as the first bell rang. "Or are you just happy to see me?" Ginger laughed, locking her bike into place. "Both, as always, Bonnie. I'll leave the cake in the staff room for everyone to try at lunch." Bonnie gave a grin and a thumbs up, the October sunshine making her short auburn hair glow like fire. "Your baking is a source of great temptation to me, Ginger Burnet," said a deep male voice from behind her. Clutching the cake box to her chest like a shield, Ginger spun around, torn between her flight, fight, or freeze instincts. "Reese," she said, as she recognised Chiswick Park's newest history teacher, trying not to stare at the way his cycling shirt clung to his broad-muscled chest. "For a big guy, you can be very quiet. You scared me." Reese frowned in consternation. With his light brown hair still mussed by his bike helmet and his dark brown eyes pinched slightly with concern, he strongly reminded Ginger of a remorseful chocolate Labrador or a worried Cocker Spaniel. "I'm terribly sorry," he said, his lilting Welsh accent making Ginger's heart flutter a little as it always did. "Would you perhaps like me to wear one of those bells they have on cats' collars?" Ginger laughed, the panic retreating as quickly as it had consumed her. "Perhaps," she said, falling into step with him as they both walked toward the main building. "Although I'm sure that would only make the Year 10 girls find you even more adorable." Reese flushed and grimaced, ruffling his hair to ease his awkwardness. "Bonnie told me last week that one of the house mothers found out a group of the girls had made an Instagram account dedicated to me," he said, opening the door for them both and ushering Ginger through ahead of him. "It was called the Chiswick Tilf, although God knows what that means." Ginger bit down on a smile. "Tilf," she said innocently. "I think it means teacher I'd like to Sweet Mary, Jesus and Joseph," he muttered, hurrying away toward the teacher's shower and changing room before she could finish. "You're a menace, Ginger. I'll see you later." Ginger laughed heartily as she continued on toward the kitchens, only remembering at the last moment that she needed to leave the cake in the staff room. Retracing her steps, she wandered through the now empty halls. Peering into the box to examine how the cake had survived her commute, she almost collided with someone as they unexpectedly turned the corner. "Ginger," said Professor Callum West, head of the English department, reaching out to steady her. "Turning up like a bad penny as usual, eh?" She couldn't help but grin at his greeting. Although she'd only been working at Chiswick Park for just over a month, Callum had been warm and friendly to her from the very start. There was an energy about his whole appearance and demeanour, the stylish kind of bald, bright blue eyes, clean-shaven, and somehow managing to look casually dressed even in the three-piece brown suit he wore every day. That drew people in. Ginger was not the exception, and she quickly counted Callum as a friend. They had plenty to talk about despite him being 15 years older than her 28 years, and he'd come to dinner at her house several times, followed by hours of drinking good scotch and listening to jazz while they had animated conversations. But right now, Callum looked distracted, peering up and down the corridor. "I don't suppose you've seen Gus Amberley while coming to school?" he asked. "I was supposed to have a meeting with him before class started, but he didn't show up." Ginger thought for a moment, trying to think if she'd seen the hunched, sullen figure of Gus Amberley, only son of one of the richest families in Chiswick, in the halls. "Sorry," she said, shrugging her shoulders helplessly. "I haven't seen him today." Callum frowned, rubbing a hand across his lined forehead. "All right, Ginger. Thank you anyway. I'll see you later." Ginger watched him go, wearing a frown of her own. Callum had never mentioned Gus to her before, but the concern in his face was serious. What was going on with Gus Amberley? Chapter 2. Ginger was soon too busy to wonder about the whereabouts of Gus Amberley. It was chicken pie for lunch that day, and all the food at Chiswick Park was made fresh. For the next several hours, Ginger was up to her elbows, almost literally, in short crust pastry. Once the pastry was finished and passed on to the other staff, who were actually assembling the pies, Ginger turned her attention to the list of baked goods she was supposed to make that day for the cafe in Melville House. Most of Ginger's day was spent in Melville House, the smallest of Chiswick Park's 7 main buildings. It had originally been built by Lord Thomas Melville, the owner during the 1750s, as guest quarters for the staff of his noble friends. Now the building served as a social space and cafe for the students who boarded at the school, with an added hospitality area for visitors. Ginger had been hired to run the cafe, a job which involved providing fresh baked goods each day. She was in the process of assembling a chocolate cake layered with honeycomb whipped cream when she felt a recognizable flustered presence behind her. "How can I help you, headmaster?" she asked, not looking away from the cake as she carefully set the top layer on top of the thick cream filling. George Harvey, the average height, slightly doughy man who was the current headmaster of Chiswick Academy, rubbed his hands together as he hovered in the doorway of the kitchen. His brown hair was thinning on top, and everyone knew he had all kinds of bizarre hair growth tricks and serums delivered to the school, so his wife didn't know. As usual, he wore a dark blue suit that might have looked distinguished on him 15 years and 20 pounds ago, but now just looked strained. But then, everything about Headmaster Harvey looked strained. "I just came from Melville House and noticed that the new cakes hadn't been put out yet," he said, fiddling with his thick-framed black glasses. "They're meant to be out by 12:20 and it's noon now and I didn't see you setting them up." The cake safely in place, Ginger dusted off her hands on her skirt, then turned to the headmaster. "Everything is ready to go," she said with forced calm. "I already heated up the coffee machine and just came back to put the cakes together. The cafe will be open at 12:30 as always, headmaster." "Good. Good to know." Headmaster Harvey lingered for a moment longer, forcing several of the kitchen porters to awkwardly skirt around him. "Can I do anything else for you?" Ginger asked, trying not to giggle as she imagined Bonnie's reaction when Ginger told the story later in the break room. "Otherwise, I really should get on. Can't have the cafe opening late, can we?" The headmaster immediately straightened, flushing as he realised he was causing a delay. "Of course not, Miss Burnet. Carry on." He turned to leave and almost ran face first into the swinging silver doors that led out of the kitchen. The kitchen staff all pretended to not have seen, but as soon as he was out of sight, the kitchen filled with muffled laughter. Ginger chuckled, shaking her head, and began loading up the hostess trolley with the cakes, muffins, brownies and scones intended for Melville House. The main halls were filled with students at this time of day, so Ginger decided to take the outside route through the decorative courtyard garden, enclosed on all four sides by the main house. The paths were made of smooth grey sandstone slabs and were edged with neatly clipped box hedges. The stone was dotted with darker patches which were still wet with the previous night's rain. Ginger turned her face to the October sun, enjoying the cool breeze after so many hours spent in the kitchens. If the weather was good that weekend, she would take her mother apple picking, she thought. Maybe she'd even be able to get her brother Valerian to come along. It wasn't as if he had done anything other than drink and mope since he'd been put on temporary suspension from the police force the month before. "I have to wonder if there is ever a moment in your day where you don't have a cake with you or something to hand." For the second time that day, Ginger was startled from her thoughts by Reese's voice. He waved from his place on a bench beside the pond at the centre of the courtyard. One ankle was propped on the opposite knee in a pose of relaxation. A book lay open on his thickly muscled thigh. "I'm working on getting a bell," he promised with a grin that made the light stubble on his cheeks, chin and upper lip catch the sun slightly. "For now I'll still be addressing you initially from a distance." Ginger laughed, slowing her pace. "I appreciate that. Pretty sure I've got a spare cat collar with a bell at home. I could bring it in tomorrow for you." Reese grinned. "It's a very kind offer, but I have my own bell supplier, thank you." "How very middle class of you," Ginger teased, halting completely as she drew level with him. "Interesting book." Reese nodded, picking it up to show her the cover. "The Moneyless Man. It's about a guy who lived completely without money for a year as an experiment, but he still lives like that now." "You'd better not let the headmaster see you reading that," Ginger said with a laugh as she continued on through the courtyard, sticking to the path that would take her across the quieter East Hall toward Melville House. "He'll be terrified Callum corrupted you and is getting you to teach all the kids about anarchy and convincing them to turn on their rich capitalist parents." "Long live the revolution!" Reese called after her, giving an overly serious salute. The rest of the afternoon for Ginger consisted of manning the counter at the little cafe in Melville House. Apart from a few prospective parents there to meet with George Harvey, it was quiet for several hours. Ginger therefore took the opportunity to sketch and doodle plans for Colin's retirement cake. Her plan was to build an entirely edible forest out of cookies, puffed rice sculpted into various shapes, and a huge amount of fondant icing. The centerpiece, however, would be the ginger cake she was currently taste testing, decorated to look like the porter cabin that had been his office for many years. The recipe she was trying to recreate was of a cake she'd had only once as a teenager. Colin had taken Ginger, her brother and her mother Dorothy, whom he'd just married, to show them where he'd grown up in Jamaica and to meet his extended family. The cake had been baked by Colin's grandmother, and even 13 years later, Ginger could remember how perfect it had been. It was the perfect thing to have as his retirement cake, but to Ginger's deep frustration, she just couldn't seem to get the recipe right. Not that she was actually working off a recipe since Colin's grandmother had died several years before, and she had never written any of her recipes down. Therefore, Ginger was working off memory and guesswork. It didn't help her case that Colin had recently become gluten intolerant, meaning she needed to make the whole cake creation gluten-free. Ginger scribbled a note on the back of her hand that she needed to buy more xanthan gum at some point. As frustrating as it was, she was enjoying the challenge. She just didn't want to give Colin something that was anything less than perfect. "Any lingering scraps for a weary vagabond?" Callum West asked, joining Ginger behind the counter. "Surprised to see you still here." Ginger glanced up at the clock. "It's 5:30 already." Callum laughed, taking one of the apple and cinnamon muffins from the display case and beginning to eat it. "Been one of those days where time is a bit malleable?" he asked. Beginning the process of shutting up the cafe and cleaning up, Ginger nodded. "It was quiet in here for most of the afternoon apart from the 3 o'clock rush, so I guess I got a bit caught up in planning Colin's cake." "How's that going?" Callum asked, sitting on the counter while Ginger tidied as if he was a rebellious teenager and not a man in his early 40s with a PhD and a mortgage. "Is he looking forward to retirement?" They chatted easily for a while about Ginger's baking plans, the conversation soon evolving into a discussion about the colonialism inherent in much of British cooking. A natural lull appeared as Ginger finished packing away the cakes for the night. "What are you doing here so late?" she asked. "Surely you didn't stay just for a muffin and a chat, not when we've got dinner this weekend." Callum shook his head, brushing the last of the crumbs off his lap. "I'm lingering because I have a meeting with a parent," he said. "And after Gus Amberley not showing to our meeting this morning, I want at least one meeting today to not be a total waste of my time." He sighed in frustration, and Ginger cocked her head in question. "I've tried everything to get through to Gus," Callum said, visibly frustrated. "After the year off he took last year for that internship his father arranged for him, it's like he doesn't care about school at all. I've talked to him during class, after class, before class. I've talked to his parents, both individually and together. I've tried to arrange a tutor for him, but he never shows up to the appointments. It's all been fruitless, and I'm running out of ways to keep him just above a failing grade." "I'm sure your faith in him is appreciated," Ginger said, turning off the display lights and closing the security grates over the service hatch. "Even if he doesn't appreciate it now, I bet he will in the future." "I guess you can't save them all, no matter how hard you try," Callum said with a weak smile and slid off the counter. "I'll see you tomorrow, Ginny. Right now I've got papers to grade while I wait for this meeting." Ginger waved goodbye as Callum returned to the main building, while she headed for the kitchens to pick up her bag. Soon she was on her bike once again, pedalling steadily through the gloaming. As she wheeled her bike up the garden path, she could see Nina and Miles asleep on the front windowsill over the radiator. Her heart warmed with love for her little companions, and her step quickened. Tonight, she decided as she opened the door, was a night for soup, good cheese and good wine. Then, cuddle time with the cats before bed. 2 meows greeted her as she closed the door behind her and took off her hat. She smiled, heading for the living room. Life was good. Chapter 3. The next morning dawned cold and miserable. A fretful wind sent the branches of the cherry tree in the rear garden into a slashing frenzy. Ginger was awoken by Miles anxiously kneading her stomach, unsettled by the weather. The only sign of Nina was her glowing golden eyes from her hiding spot in the dusty shadows on top of the wardrobe. "It's all right, Miles," Ginger murmured, carrying the cat downstairs cradled in the crook of her dressing-gown-clad arm. "I'll make you the little blanket fort before I head out to work. You can spend the whole day hiding and sleeping if you need to, baby." Ginger spent her time before work drinking coffee, comforting Miles, and researching various chocolatier techniques she would need to practice for Colin's cake. "Guess that art and sculpture degree are coming in useful in the end, aren't they, Mum and Dad?" Ginger muttered to herself, clicking on another YouTube video and starting to take more notes. Stepping out of the house, leaving behind the promised blanket fort for Miles, Ginger made it 2 steps into the lashing rain before she decided that today was a driving day, not a cycling one. Leaving her bike in the tiny garage that housed her equally tiny car, she crawled along the lane toward Chiswick Park. Her wipers were working as hard as possible, but she still had to lean forward, squinting, to see the road through the pounding water. She still arrived early, however, the drive taking less time than her usual bike ride. Parking in the staff car park beside Melville House, Ginger held her coat over her head as she ran for cover. "Wouldn't be surprised if the roads flooded," Aston, the young, overly stylish receptionist, said glumly in response to Ginger's cheerful good morning and comment about the weather. "I was meant to be going to an art show tonight too." "I'm sure it'll be fine," Ginger said breezily, wiggling the large box she held toward him. "I brought carrot cake muffins in today. Your favourite. They're still warm too." Aston's usual look of detached sullenness that he wore at all times when not interacting with guests and important members of staff brightened just slightly. As if doing a strange cake strip tease, Ginger slowly peeled the lid off the box, releasing the glorious autumnal scent of cinnamon riding on the sweet smell of carrot. "My girlfriend is trying to make me do the whole keto thing," Aston said, even as he snaked a hand out to take a muffin. "But this is mainly carrots, right? So it's healthy." "If that's what you need to tell yourself," Ginger said, not pointing out that the cream cheese icing that topped the muffins was not even remotely healthy. Leaving Aston to his denial-and-door attitude, Ginger strolled past the cafe on the route to the kitchen that meant she would be outside for the least amount of time. As she wandered along the quiet hallways, currently empty of students at 8 in the morning, she paused with a frown. Crouching, she pulled an A6 notebook, bound in red faux leather, out of one of the decorative plants. It was easy to recognise, even without opening it. Ginger had seen Callum writing in it many times before, scribbling away at lunch or during a coffee break. She assumed it was some kind of personal journal or teaching notes, and so, even though she was curious, she didn't even take a peek. Instead, she tucked it into her pocket and changed her route to pass by Callum's office, thinking she would offer him a muffin along with his lost notebook. The light was on inside, brightening the words, "Professor Callum West, Ph.D., that were painted in gold typeface on the frosted glass of the door. Rapping her knuckles quickly on the glass, Ginger opened the door without waiting for an answer. She knew at this time of day he'd be leaning back in his chair, feet up on the distinguished wooden desk, a book in one hand, and his headphones playing his favourite Rammstein songs at full volume to prepare for the day. The scene that greeted her as she stepped inside, however, was very different. It took her a moment to even process what she was seeing. Although warm with light, the room was cold. There was a patch of soaked carpet where an open window had allowed the rain to pour inside all night. The desk was in disarray. A chair had been knocked over on the side of the desk, opposite Callum's tatty black chair that he insisted didn't need replacing. In the centre of it all was Callum, dressed in the slouchy black suit from the day before, and the black lace-up shoes he once told her he'd been wearing to work every day for the last 12 years. Except yesterday had apparently been the last day. Professor Callum West was hanging from a rope attached to the old chandelier hook. To Ginger's horror, he was very much dead. Chapter 4. Ginger was still clutching the box of cold muffins when she spotted Detective Inspector Jacob Klimek making his way through the crowd of crime scene investigators. His red hair was rumpled by the wind, and his grey woolen overcoat was spotted with rain. From the smear of jam in his moustache and beard, Ginger guessed the report of the incident had interrupted his breakfast. When he saw her perched on a chair in the corner of reception, he lifted a hand in greeting. Ginger weakly returned the wave, her pounding heart rate finally beginning to slow down. Before the DI could get to her, however, he was intercepted by George Harvey, who was practically vibrating with panic. The whole school had been shut down for the day, the boarders in Melville House evacuated to the main school building, so they were out of the way of the crime scene. From Headmaster Harvey's tense whispering, it was clear that he was trying to find out from Klimek what exactly he was supposed to tell the very financially important parents of the students. Watching D.I. Klimek quickly assure the stressed headmaster, Ginger couldn't help but think of the other crime scene she had seen him at only a few months ago. He had been the DI in charge of the Arlington Manor murders that Ginger had got caught up in that August. From experience, she knew he would be finding a kind and non-condescending way to calm and placate the headmaster. She knew D.I. Klimek, or Jacob, very well. The two of them had gone to the same small secondary school in Greater Chiswick, although Jacob had been a few years ahead of her. They'd had a brief summer flirtation the summer before she went away to university in London, but they'd quickly realised they were better suited as friends. "We need to stop meeting at Creamsini's Gin," D.I. Klimek said, taking the seat beside her. "How are you doing?" His blue eyes were soft with worry, so Ginger dredged up a smile at his gentle attempt at humour. "Hey," she protested. "I've been crime scene free for nearly 2 months now. You got to give me some credit, Jacob." He patted her on the hand, then took out a small black notebook and a pen. "I know you're still in shock," he said, "but I need to ask you about this morning and about finding Professor West. Can you do that for me?"
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
Ginger nodded, straightening up. Callum was her friend. She needed to be strong for him. "From the beginning, if you can," Klimek said, pen poised above the paper. And so Ginger told him everything she could remember. Recounting the details, she found herself re-examining the situation as if from afar. The timing, state of the room, Callum's body. It all felt wrong. She trailed off in the middle of telling D.I. Klimek about Callum's usual morning routine. "Something isn't right about all this," she murmured, trying to mentally zoom in on details of the room the same way she would if she was hand-painting a design onto a cake. Klimek paused, lowering his notepad as a pale and wide-eyed Aston brought over 2 cups of tea. "Of course it doesn't feel right," he said, taking a sip. "You found the body of someone you know and care about. It's going to feel wrong, Gin." Ginger watched Jacob set down his cheerful Tetley's tea mug on the small table between them, scattered with trifolds and leaflets for counselling services, a guest lecture, studying abroad, and the dates for last summer's cricket matches. Each hairline crack in the mug looked like a gaping crevasse. The cacophony of colours and fonts and photos on the leaflets was suddenly overwhelming. "Ginger?" Jacob's voice was echoing somehow, even though the reception was a small, cosy room. There was a fierce stab of heat on her thigh, and she distantly realised that her hands were shaking so hard around her mug that she'd spilled tea on her leg. Jacob carefully lifted the cup out of her death grip and began rubbing large, soothing circles on her back. "I think that's enough for today," he said. "Just breathe deeply, Gin. In through the nose, out through the mouth." Ginger did as he said, slowly managing to get control of her breathing again. "Tell me about something else," Klimek said, not stopping the circles. "Any insane cake plans? Or have you seen Ryan lately?" Although the change in his voice was subtle, Ginger knew that Jacob was more interested in hearing her answer to the second question. "Not since he got suspended from the force," she said, resting her elbows on her knees and dropping her head to take deeper breaths. "He hasn't seen our mum either. I think he's too ashamed to face any of the family, even though we barely know what happened." "Something about getting too close to a suspect." Her brother Ryan, or Valerian as he was actually named, had until recently been a detective on the force with Klimek. That was until the beginning of September, when he had been suspended, but with pay, pending an investigation into his relationship with a female suspect, who ended up being found guilty of a range of crimes. Ginger had last seen her brother a few days before his suspension. He'd come to her house clearly in distress, but had only sat in silence at her kitchen table for half an hour, ignoring a cup of coffee and a flapjack, and then left just as suddenly as he'd arrived. Clement looked somewhat uncomfortable at the mention of Ryan, as if he regretted asking now that he realised he was caught in the conversation. "You know I want him back on the force as soon as possible," he said, handing Ginger's cup of tea back to her. "But we have to make sure we go through the proper investigation process. Even if Ryan didn't mean to aid and abet her in the crimes she committed, he still engaged in an inappropriate relationship with a suspect. It makes him appear to have questionable judgment, even though you and I both know it was just a one-time mistake." "Have you told him that?" Ginger asked, taking a sip of the now lukewarm drink. "I'm guessing he feels pretty shut out in the cold right now." Clement got to his feet, tucking the notebook away into his coat. "I'm not allowed to contact him until the internal investigation is over," he said. "But if you do see him, give Ryan my regards, will you?" "Sure," Ginger said, setting aside the drink and getting to her feet. "Do you need to know anything else about Callum, or—" "I'll be in touch to call you in for a follow-up interview," Clement said, peering up the corridor toward the teachers' offices. "Right now, I want you to go home, get some rest, and do something to get your mind off this." Ginger nodded silently, her stomach tightening as she recognised the approaching rattle of a metal gurney. The black body bag on the stretcher was supposed to preserve the dignity and identity of the deceased, she supposed, watching the porters from the morgue wheel the gurney to the waiting van outside. But it only made her think more intensely of Callum. He had been so full of life and energy and personality that for her last view of him to be shrouded in black plastic felt intensely wrong. Clement gave her a final squeeze on the arm and then left her to go and speak with the pathologist about the scene. Ginger blinked away tears, crossing to the window to watch her friend be loaded into the van. A figure approached her from the side, and she glanced over to see Rhys approaching, his hands pushed into his pockets. "I'm sorry about Callum," he said quietly, standing beside her by the window. "Sudden loss is never easy to deal with. Finding someone you're close to like that. It's a shock." The way he said it, and the haunted look in his eyes made her think he'd had that personal experience. "I thought facing death with strangers was hard," Ginger said in almost a whisper. "But it's so much worse with a friend." Rhys said nothing, as if not sure how to respond. Eventually he stepped a little closer until their arms barely touched. It should have been awkward, but Ginger appreciated the show of support, inching closer to him as if Rhys was a tether keeping her from floating away. The red beacons of the rear headlights became smaller as the van wound its way down the school's drive. Soon, the storm snuffed out the light, leaving only the afterglow on the back of Ginger's eyelids. Chapter 5. "Well, everyone in the village is in shock over the whole thing," Ginger's mother Dorothy said, spooning another helping of rice and pigeon peas into her bowl. "Carolyn Frisk even went so far as to ask if you told me anything about how you found him." She snorted, brushing one of her short brown curls off her forehead. "Nosy cow." Ginger shook her head in exasperation, mopping up the remains of Colin's speciality slow-cooked goat curry with her last bite of cocoa bread. "You'd better not have said anything, Mum," she warned. "Callum was my friend. I don't want to be ambushed into a conversation in Tesco by the morbid members of your book club." "Of course not," Dorothy said, her voice rising in protest. "Callum was a lovely man and he doesn't deserve to become cheap gossip." Colin, her stepfather, chuckled beside his wife. "If you do get awkward questions," he pointed out, "you could provide them with wildly inaccurate misinformation. Tell everyone something different. Muddy the waters, so to speak." Musing as she took a sip of her wine, Ginger shrugged. "A possible plan," she said, sharing a conspiratorial grin with Colin, but it soon slipped off her face. "Work just feels strange without Callum. We'd see each other every day and now he's just, not there. He was going to make pierogies at my place this weekend as part of our experimental cooking evenings." Colin reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm sorry, love," he said. his deep, rumbling voice with its warm Caribbean accent soothing her the way it had ever since her parents' divorce when she was 15. You're going to find a lot more of those gaps in your life, and it's going to feel strange. For a little while, it's going to feel like you've had a thread ripped out of the fabric of your world, and everything is unraveling. But you'll find a way to weave it back together again. Why not try one of your complicated imaginative baking projects? Dorothy asked, crossing her gangly legs under her on the dining chair, her glass of wine held loosely in one hand. As she often did, Ginger reflected on what a wonderfully unique person her mother was. Elegant without being fussy, curious and insightful without being pushy or irritating. She had an air of being relaxed in her own skin, but not in a sloppy, uncaring way. Right now she was wearing her painter's smock over harem pants and a blue denim shirt that Ginger knew she'd owned since before either of her children were born. There was a smudge of canary yellow paint on the bridge of her nose, and she'd clearly forgotten about the pencil she'd jammed into her tangle of brown hair. I wanted to talk to the two of you about that, actually, Ginger said, picking up the dropped grains of rice from off the autumnal-coloured tablecloth. About the baking thing. Anything more specific, Ginny? Colin asked, taking a sip from his bottle of homemade scrumpy cider. Well, Ginger leaned back in her chair, nibbling on another piece of coconut bread. It's about your retirement party cake, and I don't want to give too much away, but I need some help with the recipe. Dorothy waved a hand vaguely toward the kitchen. I've got some great tricks for helping with the gluten-free baking. It's less about the gluten-free thing and more about the recipe itself, Ginger said. I had your Nana's ginger cake once, Colin. I'm trying to recreate it from memory since she didn't leave it written down. She shrugged helplessly. I'm sure it will be wonderful, Gin, Colin said, taking another drink. You've got a great instinct for ingredients and taste. Sure, Ginger said. It tastes good, but not like hers. Do you think one of your family back in Jamaica could try and remember what the recipe was? I'll send an email out to see if anyone can help, Colin said, draining his bottle. But whatever you come up with, I know the cake will be wonderful. Of course it will, Dorothy said, changing position to drape her bare feet over her husband's legs. That spread that you put on for the Bowls Club last weekend? I've been getting texts and emails about it all week. They can't wait for when you can next do it. Well, why don't I give you a preview of a creation I'm working on? Ginger said, hopping out of her chair, glad to be focused on other things. I brought a cake. I'd be more surprised if you hadn't brought one of your experiments, Colin said, gathering up the bowls. I'll get it from the kitchen. Maybe grab another bottle on your way back, my sweet, Dorothy called after Colin, a soft look in her eyes as she watched her husband. I hate to bring the mood down, Ginger said, leaning forward and lowering her voice. But have you heard from Ryan lately? Or seen him? Dorothy sighed, and Ginger felt some regret as she watched the calm and relaxation drain from her mother's face. I haven't heard from or seen Valerian in a while, Dorothy said slowly. Even at the best of times, he didn't like coming here because of Colin, and I got tired of that, so I refused to go to visit him until he came to dinner with me and Colin. I'm assuming he hasn't taken you up on the offer yet, Ginger guessed, rubbing a hand across her eyes. Why does he have to be so difficult? We're not teenagers anymore. Continuing to throw a tantrum in your 30s about your mum remarrying when you were 18 is just embarrassing. As we've both repeatedly told him, Dorothy said dryly, emptying her wineglass in one final gulp. But I am worried about him, so maybe go and check on him this weekend. Make him a cake and take it over. She held up a hand as Ginger began to protest. It'll help take your mind off the fact that Callum won't be there for experimental food night. Fine, Ginger muttered, the conversation drawing to a close as Colin returned from the kitchen. In one hand was a cherry upside-down cake, dripping blood-red syrup onto the green patterned serving plate. In the other was a bottle of wine. Let's finish this evening off in style, shall we, ladies? He said with a grin, setting down his gifts and crossing to the stereo. Soon the music of Duke Ellington filled the room with bright, brassy warmth. Dorothy got up from her chair, pulling her husband into a dance, and Ginger watched them both with a smile. The dead didn't have to be forgotten for life to go on. I thought I'd had my fill of bad stuff for this year, Ginger said, making herself an evening cup of peppermint tea as usual. I mean, when you survive the Arlington Manor murders, I feel like it uses up several years of bad luck at once, right? You'd think so. From the laptop open on the table, Maggie McFelder released a deep sigh. Yet somehow the universe didn't get that particular memo. I'm so sorry about Callum. I know he was a good friend to you when you started at the school and everyone was being weird because of, you know. The soothing tones of her friend's Scottish accent helped Ginger relax her shoulders slightly. Her friendship with Maggie, a Filipino-Scot currently working as a sound director for a theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon, had begun in the most unlikely of places. They had both survived a uniquely horrifying reality baking show that August, which had ended in several murders, and the downfall of a knight of the realm. Now the two of them talked via video often, and Maggie had even come to stay at the cottage for a weekend in September. It just doesn't make sense to me, Ginger said, pottering around the kitchen, tidying things away in her daily ritual. I know that everyone is saying Callum took his own life, but I can't help but think that's not what happened. People can be suicidal and not look like it, Gin, Maggie said gently, looking away from the screen as she tapped away at her other computer. Sorry, just making sure all the sound cues are in order. We had one screw-up last night. Let me tell you that 30 seconds of silence does not improve a black box theatre version of Henry V Part 1, where the set is made entirely of cardboard. Ginger laughed, but her heart wasn't in it. All the peace she'd managed to gather over dinner with her mother and Colin had dissipated as soon as she'd arrived home. You know, she said, pausing in cleaning and speaking straight to Maggie. I got home from dinner this evening and I found myself just staring at this scarf that Callum accidentally left behind after our last experimental cooking session. She tapped her fingernails on the mug in a random pattern of notes. He said he'd pick it up this weekend, but that's obviously not going to happen, so what am I supposed to do with it now? Maggie had stopped her work to listen. Her sweet, round face, complete with her strawberry cupcake nose stud, was so filled with sympathy and concern that Ginger had to blink back tears. I can't just leave it there, she said, wiping at her eyes. It's Callum's, but I don't know if there's someone who should get it or whether he has any family, and I know people will say to me, oh, it's only a scarf, not need to think about it so hard. But it matters because he was my friend and I don't want to always look at that scarf on my coat rack, wishing I'd been brave and found out the truth about it. Maggie sighed softly. In the background, Ginger could hear an announcement for people to begin taking their seats. You need to work, Ginger said, forcing a smile. Sorry for the word vomit. Needed to vent, I guess. Have you considered that you maybe weren't talking about Callum's scarf just now? Maggie asked, apparently uncaring of the countdown clock to curtain on the wall behind her. If you think there's something more to this, tell that hunky DI about your worries when you have your follow-up interview. You guys know each other. I'm sure he'll take you seriously. Ginger nodded slowly. I'll do that, she said. Maybe see if he'll tell me about the official cause of death. We'll talk tomorrow, Maggie said, her assistant stepping into frame. Love you, girl. Bye. The call ended, and Ginger stared at the black screen, thoughts racing. At her feet, Nina meowed insistently, butting her head against Ginger's ankles. I know, Ginger said, closing the laptop. Bedtime for everyone. Tomorrow is a whole new day. Chapter 6. For the rest of the week, Ginger tried to find some new kind of rhythm. The school reopened despite the dark pall hanging over the building. Callum's office remained off-limits for the foreseeable future, the doorway trailing morbid streamers of police tape. I hate going to my office even more now, Bonnie said to Ginger one afternoon in the staff room. Having to walk past Callum's office all closed up like that gives me the creeps. I keep expecting him to come wandering into the cafe in Melville House in search of the unsellable cake remains, Ginger said quietly, picking at the slice of homemade leek and red onion quiche she'd brought for lunch. I've closed up late twice this week because I was subconsciously waiting for him. So, can you imagine how awkward it must be for the substitute? Raquel Mitchell, the Year 8 maths teacher, asked, looking up from the essays she was grading on the opposite side of the table. Having to replace a beloved teacher who died on campus only a few days ago. Ginger closed her eyes and shook her head, banishing the memory of opening the door to Callum's office that fateful morning. "Oh gosh, I'm sorry," Raquel said, instantly remorseful. "That made me sound like a right prick, as if it's all just some petty staffing inconvenience. I'm so sorry." "Why don't you go and grab us all a mulled apple juice from the dining hall?" Bonnie suggested, cutting over the other teacher's increasingly uncomfortable rambling. "Assuming the great hungry horde of the student body didn't drink it all at lunch." "Sure," Raquel said, quickly getting to her feet. "Do you want anything from the dining hall while I'm over there, Reese?" Reese, who was sitting at the next table over, sharply looked up from his book. It was clear he had been fully immersed in its pages, and Ginger felt a moment of very specific sympathy for him. There was nothing quite as irritating as being rudely pulled out of the experience of reading a good book. "Nothing for me, thanks," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the blank-looking box of unseasoned chicken breast, couscous, and steamed kale he was making his way through. "Got everything I need right here." "Oh, surely you'd like a little sweet treat," Raquel cooed, propping one hand on her hip as she lingered beside Reese. "That looks like such a boring meal." Bonnie's face settled into an unimpressed scowl, and she rolled her eyes at Ginger, who had to smother a smile. Raquel had not been subtle in her pursuit of Reese since he started at the school that September. Her standard wardrobe of pencil skirts and warm-toned sweaters had become noticeably tighter over the past few weeks, and she now wore her black hair down in soft movie star curls instead of up in her usual severe bun. "You know," Bonnie muttered behind her hand to Ginger, "even if I hadn't had the blessing of being born gay, I'd pretend I was to avoid whatever brainwashing Raquel went through that told her this is how you start a healthy, organic relationship in the workplace." Ginger winced as Raquel leaned over Reese's table, apparently intent on seeing what he was reading, but also pushing her shoulder blades together to thrust out her chest in his direction. "Poor Reese," Ginger murmured, keeping her face turned away from the scene, although I will admit that watching his discomfort is helping me feel slightly less miserable. "Do you remember how Callum started doing a David Attenborough-type commentary whenever Raquel started bothering Reese?" Bonnie said, keeping her voice low even though Raquel had finally left the staff room. Ginger laughed, sputtering with her mouth full. The light-hearted interaction boosted her throughout the rest of the day. For once, she wasn't alone in the Melville House Cafe. Two of the full-time boarders, a set of 15-year-old best friends named Louise and Amelia, always finished early on a Friday afternoon and would come and hang out behind the counter with Ginger. "I don't know why Headmaster Harvey insists on having this place open all day during the week," Louise said, sitting on the counter and swinging her legs back and forth. "You must get bored out of your mind standing here all day." "It's actually a nice break after the madness of the lunch rush," Ginger said, continuing her test run at endeavouring to sculpt puffed rice and marshmallow into recognisable trees for Colin's cake. "And then there's the 4 o'clock rush as classes end," Amelia pointed out, pausing her task of mixing up another batch of the sticky material for Ginger, which we've got half an hour to prep for, by the way. "Ah, yes," Louise said, knocking back another shot of espresso. "The rush, when we have 6 customers during the hour rather than 2. The gentle bickering continued until the 2 girls were gathered by a group of other boarders who made up the 4 o'clock rush to go to an evening study group. Waving them off with sticky hands, Ginger put all her focus into her sculpture. It reminded her of the hours she'd spend in the sculpture studio at university, trying to translate her mental images into clay. But she'd never been happy with her attempts, always finding flaws and issues when they came out of the kiln. Once it was set by the fire, the shining idea that she had seen during the creative process seemed less important. But with baking, the effect the fire had was very different. The fire was only the beginning of the creation process. The options were, in many ways, infinite. The rice and marshmallow mixture was more like clay, but Ginger wasn't worried about the finished product. She just wanted to see how successfully the shape would hold. If she was going to make trees of any reasonable height, there needed to be some structural integrity to the mix. She had no real form in mind, just letting her hands and whims guide her. However, she soon found that the sculpture, now nearly a foot high, was beginning to take on Callum's features. Grief slowed her movements and Ginger stood back for a moment, wishing she could show her friend the ridiculous likeness and knowing that she never could. "I didn't realise you were still here, Miss Burnet." George Harvey wandered into the cafe, seeming to drag an air of gloom in with him. He took a seat at the little round table closest to the counter, taking off his glasses and letting out a weary sigh. Although the headmaster always had a look of nervous tension about him, Ginger couldn't help but notice that he looked even more stressed and exhausted than usual. "I was just finishing off a little test project," she said, pointing to the lumpy sculpture. "But you look like you need a cup of tea and a piece of cake. You're a fan of coffee and walnut cake, yes? Take a break while I tidy up." She washed her hands as she spoke, scooting the sculpture off to the side. Harvey nodded slowly, something almost resembling a smile tugging at his thin lips. "That sounds wonderful, Miss Burnet, thank you." "You can call me Ginger, you know," Ginger said, making a cup of traditional Earl Grey, the only tea Headmaster Harvey would drink. "Things don't need to be formal all the time, especially when it's just the two of us." He gave another nod, even going so far as to loosen the knot of his tie. Ginger felt slightly guilty as she watched her employer relax, because her motivations for making him feel calmer weren't entirely agenda-free. She didn't doubt that Harvey had been kept up to date on the investigation into Callum's death, and one thing she had quickly picked up about the headmaster was that he liked to feel important. As she cleaned up around him, refilling his tea twice, Ginger carefully eased information out of George Harvey. Most of what he told her was expected, that he had parents of students sending letters of concern, ranging in tone from worried to filled with rage. Journalists were calling the school, trying to dig up dirt on how and why a teacher died. He was trying to make sure all of the students were coping with the sudden loss, and he was worried the teachers' union would come after him, citing poor working conditions as the cause for Callum's apparent suicide. Ginger, who had finished closing up for the day and was now sitting opposite him at the table, nodded along sympathetically. "It can't be easy trying to balance it all and also run the school as normal," she said. "You have no idea," Harvey said emphatically, finishing off his second piece of cake. "And I've got the police hounding me for CCTV footage of the office corridor because they want to know if anyone was with Callum the night before the morning of the incident." Ginger limited her reaction to a subtle raising of her eyebrows, even though her thoughts were whirling. From the moment she found Callum, she'd had her suspicions that he hadn't died by choice. Did the police have evidence which supported her theory? Or were they just doing due diligence? "Only thing is," Harvey said, leaning in and speaking in a conspiratorial whisper, "the cameras in that hallway haven't been working properly for a week now. Damn things keep cutting in and out. So now I've got to find a way to tell the police that, without sounding like the school is unsafe. Because if I've already got Arthur bloody Amberley breathing down my neck, then all the other parents will join if they—" Ginger's ears pricked up at the sound of Arthur Amberley's name, even as Harvey cut himself off. From his expression, it was clear that he'd let slip information he'd rather keep private. Almost immediately, he got to his feet, tightening his tie once again. "I'd kindly ask you to keep this conversation to yourself, Miss Burnet," he said sternly. "No one needs to know about any of what I told you. Understand?" Ginger mimed locking her lips and throwing away a key. With a terse nod, the headmaster hurried out of the cafe, leaving Ginger puzzling over this new information. Was Arthur Amberley putting pressure on George Harvey because he was rich, entitled and bullying? Or might it have something to do with that meeting the morning before Callum died that he was supposed to have with Gus? Chapter 7. In the classic manner of mid-October, it was raining when Ginger finally made her way toward the bike rack. She pulled up the hood of her coat around her face with a shudder. Her ears were so insulated that she almost missed the sound of Reese calling her. Squinting through the rain, and against the white light of the floodlights, Ginger saw Reese waving to her from the window of a muddy 444. "Do you want a lift home?" he called, shouting against the rain. You can sling the bike in the back and stay dry. Ginger jogged over to the car, resting her forearms on the edge of the lowered window. Would you mind? I'd be willing to pay you with food. Rhys began to protest, but Ginger cut him off. I know you like keeping in shape, but watching you eat the same boring thing every day for lunch is breaking my heart, she teased. Lucky for you, I was planning to make vegan, gluten-free sweet potato gnocchi with cheese sauce and oven-roasted brassicas. Delicious, easy to make, and super healthy. Rhys grimaced. I don't know, he said slowly. The words gluten-free and vegan are usually warning signs for me. Ginger slapped him lightly on the shoulder. It didn't escape her notice that the muscle was solid. It's really good, I swear, she said. Just because I put butter in basically everything that I bake doesn't mean I don't know how to cook without it. Besides, she looked down, it would be really nice to have some human company. Callum and I were meant to hang out tonight and, well... The idling engine hummed, filling the long silence. Rhys finally nodded slowly. He took out his phone and tapped away at the screen, then put it back in his pocket. Just needed to let my mum know I'll be home late, he explained. Now let me fold down the back seat so you can get your bike in. You live with your mother? Ginger asked, tutting, stepping back to let Rhys climb out the car. Whatever would Raquel think? I'm sure she spent weeks mentally redecorating the bachelor pad she assumed you had. Rhys laughed, folding down the back seats in his car and opening the boot. It's a temporary thing, he said, and she technically lives with me. Ginger raised her hands. Hey, I admire you for looking after your mum. I'll even send you home with extra food for her. Rhys's eyes widened a little. How much food are you planning to make? He asked, but then carried on before she could reply. You know what? As long as you don't mind me eating your food, I'd be happy to join you for dinner. Mainly so I can meet your famous cats, just to be clear, he added with a grin. Ginger returned the grin. I've seen your distressingly boring lunches, Mr. Morgan, she teased. Let me show you how dinner is really done. Do you mind if I ask you a slightly personal question? Rhys asked, rolling another strip of sweet potato gnocchi and cutting it into bite-sized pieces. Ginger scooped out the cooked gnocchi floating on top of the boiling water, tossing them into the bowl already filled with golden orange pillows. Ask away, but I'm pretty sure I know what you're going to ask about. She tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. You want to know about Arlington Manor, right? He frowned, passing her the next batch of gnocchi to cook. What? No, I've never heard of that. I was going to ask if you and Callum were maybe... more than friends? It's none of my business, he quickly added, but I figured if you were a... thing... but were keeping it on the down low, then maybe you felt like you couldn't show how much you were hurting. Rhys didn't meet her eyes as he spoke, and instead fussed at his hands, rubbing the remnants of gnocchi dough. Ginger dusted off the flour on her apron and crossed to her double-wide oven, checking on the tray of roasted broccoli, leeks and spouts, seasoned with garlic, salt, pepper, thyme, and olive oil. That wasn't the question I was expecting, to be fair, she said, picking up her glass of non-alcoholic sangria from off the counter and taking a drink. But no, Callum and I were friends, that's all. We shared a lot of interests and he wasn't weird around me when I started at the school. Rhys frowned and Ginger felt his eyes on her as she retrieved the nutritional yeast that she used to make the vegan cheese sauce from the pantry. Why would people be weird around you? He asked. I'm kind of new to the area, I know, but did I completely miss the fact you're some kind of local celebrity? Laughing, Ginger shook her head, starting on the sauce while the next batch of gnocchi cooked. Yes and no, she said, whisking gluten-free flour together with melted margarine to make the base bechamel. Notorious is perhaps a better term. Could you get me the soy milk from the fridge, please? Rhys did so, carefully stepping around Miles, who was asleep in the middle of the floor on a spot where the underfloor heating was particularly warm. Am I supposed to keep asking questions about this? Rhys asked lightly, passing Ginger the milk. Or are you trying to hint to me that you don't want to talk about it and I'm being a dullard? I don't think a teacher should be using words like dullard, Mr. Morgan, Ginger teased, slowly adding the milk to the pan and whisking the mixture into a silky white sauce. And I'm not trying to hide anything, She trailed off, using the need to fish out the cooked gnocchi as an opportunity to think. I was involved in a hostage-type situation during the summer at a place called Arlington Manor, she said eventually, holding up a calming hand as she watched Reese's eyes go wide. I'm fine now, for the most part. I've been left with a little lingering trauma and a distrust of reality shows. But I was one of the lucky ones. You're more than welcome to read about it online, but I don't really want to talk about it. Not tonight, at least. I'm so sorry, Reese said quietly, petting Nina where she was curled up on one of the chairs at the kitchen table. I had no idea you'd gone through that. I certainly won't bug you about it. His dark eyes warm with genuine sympathy, and none of the morbid curiosity Ginger usually saw when people realised that she'd been a part of the Arlington Manor murders. It made some part of her trust him more than she normally would trust someone who was, essentially, a work acquaintance. Could you get me some bay leaves, please? Ginger asked, wanting to distract Reese for a moment so she could decide, unwatched, whether to bring him in on her suspicions about Callum's death. They're in the pantry, in a glass jar with bay leaves written on it, covered by a cloth lid. The organisation in your kitchen is intimidating, Reese joked, stepping into the walk-in pantry. Is everything else in your house alphabetised? The books are arranged by colour and my wardrobe by fabric type, Ginger called, moving the sauce off the heat as the background jazz disappeared. I'm going to go and put another record on. I'll just be a second. She let her thoughts wander as she picked out a new record and put it onto the turntable. Reese certainly spent more time among the teachers and their gossip that Ginger did, even though he had started at the same time as her. Maybe he'd seen or heard things about Callum that might either support her suspicions or discount them. With Nat King Cole now filling the cottage with music, Ginger returned to the kitchen. She found Reese crouched on the floor, scratching Miles behind the ears. The bay leaves were on the counter by the stovetop. I swear I didn't invite you over to just talk about doom and gloom, she said, tossing 2 bay leaves into the pan of sauce and moving it back onto the heat. But did anything about Callum's behaviour strike you as odd in the past few weeks? Reese moved to sit cross-legged on the floor, allowing Miles to climb onto his lap. I didn't know Callum well enough to know if he seemed different, he said slowly. But every other teacher I've heard talking about it said they didn't see it coming at all. Ginger kept whisking the sauce, shaking in the nutritional yeast to add a cheesy flavour. You know, I saw him only a few hours before what people think he did. He was still wearing the same clothes the next morning when I found him. He didn't go home, but... She stopped whisking, catching her emotions. He seemed fine, Reese. Surely if he felt so hopeless that there seemed like no way out, we would have been able to see it. Right? People are very good at hiding their true feelings, Reese said gently, continuing to pet Miles. Even those in the most terrible pain can appear fine to others. I mean, my dad was sick for a long time and I didn't know until he only had a few weeks left. That's hard to hear, Reese, I'm sorry, Ginger murmured, turning off the heat to the oven. Reese shrugged. I'm dealing with it, he said, looking up at her. And having my mum live with me until she decides where she wants to live next has been good for both of us, I think. But I called him every week, Ginger. We'd meet up every few weeks. Our relationship was strong. But I still didn't know the pain he was in. Hell, my mum lived with him and she didn't know long before I did. Ginger nodded, then turned away to take the vegetables out of the oven. She sometimes forgot that not everyone had experienced murder up close and personal the way she had. People were more likely to think that Callum had simply hidden away his struggles and finally lost the battle. But some part of her knew that couldn't be the case. The open window, the chaotic room, and his behaviour during their last interaction told her that there was something more sinister and completely unknown at hand. Perhaps it was better to not share her worries with someone like Reese. She did, however, know someone she could ask about these kinds of things. Tomorrow she would make a social visit. Facing Reese again, she made sure to wear a warm smile. I think we need to lift our spirits up, she said brightly, holding out the steaming tray. And the best way to do that, I find, is with good, hearty food. Are you ready to eat?
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.